May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In the basement of the aging administrative building at Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Deere sat surrounded by towering stacks of IBM punch cards, each one densely marked with strings of numerical codes. The fluorescent light above cast a harsh glare on the desk, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating despite the whirring fans of the machines. Days of continuous work had left his eyes raw and his mind stretched thin. Stimulants kept him alert, but they could not relieve the burden of the decisions his analyses might dictate. Deere's hand shook slightly as he annotated another worksheet, meticulously checking code sequences against the patterns painstakingly compiled over 6 months. These were not ordinary calculations. Every number, every pattern could potentially determine the fate of the Pacific Fleet and the survival of thousands of American servicemen. One misinterpretation could turn months of effort into catastrophic failure. The IBM machines, mechanical giants of precision and noise, hummed endlessly, processing the intercepted Japanese transmissions. Each card represented not just data, but the culmination of countless hours of methodical work, cross-referencing, and cryptanalysis by a team pushed far beyond ordinary limits. The responsibility pressed down with a weight that no sleep or stimulant could relieve. Above, on the 3rd floor, Admiral Chester Nimitz waited for intelligence that would guide his next strategic deployment. The Pacific Fleet had already suffered a series of setbacks since the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the situation remained precarious. Any decision he made would need to weigh heavily against incomplete information, relying on the analytical rigor of Dyer and his team to provide a lifeline of clarity in a storm of uncertainty. The choice of where to commit America's remaining carriers would be decisive, possibly irreversible. At Dyer's side, Commander Joseph Rochefort, in a bathrobe and slippers, reviewed code sheets with equal intensity. His unconventional attire was a practical response to the heat radiating from the IBM machines and the stifling air of the basement rather than an eccentricity. For these men, military protocol was secondary to the urgent task of decoding the enemy's plans. The air smelled faintly of sweat and ink, a tangible reminder of the physical and mental strain required to transform raw intercepts into actionable intelligence. The intercepted Japanese communications were clear. The Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing a major offensive, its scale the largest since the Pearl Harbor attack. 4 fleet carriers, dozens of support vessels, and hundreds of veteran pilots were mobilized for the operation. The critical uncertainty was the target, encrypted under the code AF. Identifying what AF represented was the task that now dominated every thought in that basement. Any error would be catastrophic. The strategic calculus was stark. Japan had 10 fleet carriers at its disposal. The United States, only 3, one of which the Yorktown was still recovering from damage sustained at the Battle of the Coral Sea. A misstep in positioning these limited resources, informed by flawed analysis, could allow Japan to deliver a decisive blow, achieving what the Pearl Harbor attack had failed to do: annihilate American naval strength in the Pacific. The responsibility bore down on every analyst in that room, knowing that their work over the past half-year might be the only thing standing between victory and disaster. This intense focus had its roots 6 months earlier, a period of relentless labor that would ultimately influence the trajectory of the Pacific War. Every pattern discerned, every calculation made in the dimly lit basement at Pearl Harbor had the potential to shift the balance of power, save thousands of lives, and alter the course of history. The next week would prove the significance of their effort, as the question of AF would come to define the fate of an entire theater of war. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Hawaiian Islands were bathed in sunlight with a sense of calm that belied the tragedy soon to unfold. Local families were preparing for church services, while sailors stationed on battleships at Pearl Harbor were finishing breakfast or savoring a few last moments of rest on what should have been an uneventful Sunday. The Pacific Fleet lay anchored, formidable yet unsuspecting, oblivious to the imminent disaster. At precisely 7:55 a.m., the fragile calm was shattered. A force of 353 Japanese planes descended on the harbor in 2 coordinated waves, striking with devastating accuracy. The operation had been orchestrated by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a strategist of exceptional foresight who understood Japan's fleeting advantage in naval power as well as America's long-term industrial capacity. His plan was clear: cripple the Pacific Fleet before the United States could mobilize its enormous resources, secure 6 to 12 months to consolidate control over territories in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and then negotiate a favorable peace from a position of dominance. Within the span of 2 hours, the harbor had been transformed into a scene of destruction. 8 American battleships were sunk or badly damaged. The USS Arizona suffered a catastrophic explosion when an 1,800-pound armor-piercing bomb penetrated its forward magazine, instantly killing more than 1,100 crewmen. The blast lifted the 30,000-ton ship from the water, disintegrating it in moments before it sank to the harbor floor. Witnesses aboard nearby vessels would carry the memory of Arizona's violent destruction for the rest of their lives. The USS Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo strikes opened massive breaches on its port side, trapping 429 sailors and Marines. Some of them survived for hours in air pockets, their desperate pounding on the hull audible to rescuers who could not reach them in time. The USS West Virginia settled into the harbor, claiming 106 lives. Unlike Arizona and Oklahoma, West Virginia would eventually be salvaged, repaired, and returned to combat, participating in critical battles across the Pacific. On that day, however, it symbolized the vulnerability of the United States Navy. More than 180 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and hangars, maintenance shops, and other support facilities were reduced to rubble. Casualty reports revealed the full extent of the attack. 243 Americans were killed, 2,008 Navy, 109 Marines, 218 Army personnel, and 68 civilians, while over 1,000 more were wounded. The Pacific Fleet, the cornerstone of American defense in the region, was left in ruins. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the fleet, watched helplessly from his headquarters as the flames consumed his command. Amid the chaos, a spent bullet shattered a nearby window. Kimmel picked it up, examining the deformed metal in quiet reflection. He later told an aide that it would have been a mercy if the shot had ended his life, recognizing that his career had effectively ended and that he would bear the blame for the nation's greatest naval defeat. Within days, he would be replaced by Admiral Chester Nimitz, and his request for a court-martial to restore his reputation would be denied. The responsibility for Pearl Harbor would shadow him permanently. Despite the scale of devastation, the Japanese attack overlooked the most crucial targets. All 3 of America's Pacific carriers were absent that morning. The USS Enterprise was returning from a mission to deliver aircraft to Wake Island, delayed by weather that ultimately proved fortuitous. The USS Lexington was en route to Midway, and the USS Saratoga remained in dry dock on the west coast for maintenance. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, would prove decisive in the coming war, a shift in naval strategy few recognized at the time. Japanese planners also ignored the harbor's fuel depots, vast installations holding millions of gallons of oil essential for fleet operations, along with repair facilities, dry docks, and submarine bases. They assumed these assets would be inconsequential once the battleships were neutralized. They were profoundly mistaken. The intact infrastructure at Pearl Harbor would soon become the foundation for America's counteroffensive, enabling the Pacific Fleet to recover and strike back. Though the attack inflicted catastrophic damage, the survival of the aircraft carriers and key logistical facilities ensured that the United States retained the capacity to wage war across the Pacific. The events of December 7 would mark not only a moment of national tragedy but also the beginning of a strategic pivot, signaling the decline of battleships as the centerpiece of naval power and the emergence of carrier. The submarines stationed at Pearl Harbor were poised to strike a severe blow to Japanese commercial shipping. Meanwhile, the naval repair facilities on the island had the capacity to restore damaged vessels, including those the Japanese assumed had been permanently lost. Within a matter of months, Pearl Harbor would shift from a symbol of defeat to a bustling hub, central to sustaining the U.S. war effort in the Pacific. Deep beneath the harbor, in a dim, windowless basement, Commander Joseph Rochefort faced an extraordinary challenge. Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence operation based in Hawaii, had been monitoring Japanese communications for several years, but progress had been painstakingly slow. Officially known as the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, the station was universally referred to as Hypo, a phonetic nod to H, which stood for Haya, Hawaii, the location of one of its key radio intercept towers. Before the events of December 7, the station could decipher roughly 10 to 15% of Japanese naval messages, often only partially. This level of insight offered some value, but it fell far short of the intelligence needed to anticipate major attacks such as the one that would devastate Pearl Harbor. The principal Japanese naval cipher, labeled JN-25 by American analysts, was an intricate system comprising roughly 30,000 to 33,000 five-digit groups, each representing a single word or phrase. The Japanese enhanced the complexity by layering an additional encryption scheme over the codebook entries. After translating a message into code groups, they applied additive tables containing random five-digit numbers to further obscure the text. These numbers were combined using non-carrying addition, producing strings of figures that seemed entirely random and resistant to standard frequency analysis or pattern detection. For American cryptanalysts, breaking JN-25 demanded a two-stage process. First, they had to remove the additive layer through mathematical techniques. Then, they needed to determine the meaning of each code group by painstakingly studying thousands of intercepted messages, searching for patterns and repeated usage. Identifying the correct additive table and the precise starting point for each message often required testing hundreds of possibilities, informed only occasionally by message indicators or radio call signs. The Japanese frequently rotated both codebooks and additive tables, forcing analysts to begin again from scratch, rendering months of work obsolete overnight. Each additive book consisted of 300 pages, each page containing 105-digit numbers. To encrypt a message, a sender would begin at a specified page and line, adding each number sequentially to the corresponding code group. A recipient, knowing the starting point, could reverse the process to retrieve the original code. For American analysts, discovering which book and starting point had been used was a formidable obstacle, often requiring countless trial and error attempts. Just 6 days prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, on December 1, 1941, the Japanese introduced an updated version of JN-25, later referred to by U.S. analysts as JN-25B. This version included a new codebook and fresh additive tables, wiping out all prior progress. Every code group previously understood became meaningless, and every decryption technique required reassessment. Analysts were left staring at streams of inscrutable five-digit numbers, equivalent in opacity to ancient hieroglyphs. Commander Rochefort, however, was aware that an attack was imminent somewhere in the Pacific. Analysis of communication patterns without necessarily decoding the messages themselves revealed heightened Japanese naval activity. Ships were on the move, message volume had increased, and radio call signs were changing more frequently. Yet the task force that struck Pearl Harbor had maintained perfect radio silence during their voyage from Japan. For 11 days, the 6 aircraft carriers and their escorts transmitted nothing, leaving no signals to trace or analyze. It was an intelligence blind spot of unprecedented magnitude. Pieces of information existed, but there was never a complete picture. Some alerts had reached Washington through partially decoded Japanese diplomatic messages, encrypted using a different system called Purple, which indicated rising tensions but offered no operational details. The attack struck without warning, delivering a shock of immense proportions. Rochefort understood that dwelling on this failure would accomplish nothing. The only way to prevent future disasters lay in breaking the enemy's codes. If Station Hypo could successfully decipher JN-25B and extract operational information, the United States could regain the strategic initiative and provide Admiral Nimitz with actionable intelligence, potentially offsetting Japan's temporary advantage in knowledge of USI movements. Joseph Rochefort's path to this critical role was unconventional. Born in Dayton, Ohio, on May 12, 1900, he enlisted in the Navy in 1918 at age 17, falsifying his birth year to appear older and more eligible for advancement, a discrepancy that would remain in his records throughout his career. After graduating from the Navy's steam engineering program at Stevens Institute of Technology, he was commissioned as an ensign in June 1919. Early in his career, Rochefort seemed unremarkable, progressing through routine assignments without distinction. Yet a perceptive colleague recognized a unique aptitude. Rochefort excelled at solving crossword puzzles and at auction bridge, a game demanding memory, logic, and the ability to discern patterns under pressure. These skills were far from trivial. They revealed a mind capable of detecting order and complexity, of making logical deductions from incomplete data, a perfect match for the nascent field of naval cryptanalysis. In the 1922nd, this field comprised a small, poorly funded group working in cramped offices, struggling to decode the communications of potential adversaries. Rochefort's talents would soon prove pivotal in transforming that effort into a decisive strategic advantage. Rochefort exhibited exceptional talent from the beginning, but his abilities extended beyond pure mathematics. In the late 1922, the US Navy assigned him to Japan for an intensive 3-year program in language and cultural studies, spanning from 1929 to 1932. During this period, he resided in Tokyo, attending the Navy's language school while immersing himself deeply in Japanese society. He went beyond learning the language alone, gaining insight into Japanese thought patterns, communication styles, and the ways in which their military hierarchy influenced decision-making processes. He developed a nuanced understanding of concepts such as honor, duty, and structured communication, knowledge that later became critical to his cryptanalytic work. When the Pacific War erupted, this combination of linguistic, cultural, and analytical expertise made Rochefort an ideal choice to command Station Hypo. His deputy and lead cryptanalyst, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, brought complementary strengths to the unit. Dyer, a graduate of the Naval Academy, had trained under Agnes Driscoll, a pioneering figure in naval cryptanalysis. Driscoll, affectionately called Miss Aggie within the cryptologic community, had been breaking codes since World War I and was instrumental in adapting IBM punch card machines for code breaking in the 1920 and 1930. Her innovations transformed the field, and Dyer's mentorship under her gave him an extraordinary facility for pattern recognition. Dyer possessed an almost encyclopedic recall of code groups, capable of intuiting missing elements in partially decoded messages by drawing on prior context and usage patterns. In the months leading up to the Battle of Midway, he often labored through long shifts, relying on amphetamines to remain alert, a common practice among personnel engaged in high-stakes intelligence work. Reflecting on this period, Dyer explained that the urgency of the mission outweighed any personal health risks. Within the cryptanalysis office, a tongue-in-cheek sign read, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps," capturing the intense and unconventional nature of their environment. The cryptanalysis section operated under conditions far from typical military rigor. In the sweltering basement workspace, officers often worked in shirt sleeves and slippers, as the IBM machines produced excessive heat and ventilation was poor. Hierarchical rank mattered far less than the ability to deliver results. Rochefort cultivated a collaborative culture in which junior officers could challenge senior colleagues, and credit for breakthroughs was shared among the team rather than assigned to individuals. His guiding principle was simple: we can achieve anything as long as no one is concerned with personal credit. This approach proved vital in tackling JN-25, a complex Japanese naval code, which demanded cooperative problem observations from enlisted radio operators, cultural context provided by linguists, and analytical reasoning from cryptanalysts all contributed to decoding efforts. The linguistic component of Station Hypo was headed by Marine Captain Alva Laswell, who, like Rochefort, had spent several years in Tokyo studying Japanese. By the time of Midway, Laswell had been promoted to major, though historical records often still referred to him by his previous rank. He led a team of 5 linguists, the Navy's foremost specialists in Japanese, tasked with translating intercepted messages once partially decrypted by cryptanalysts. Their work provided essential context, distinguishing between routine communications and potential operational signals such as movements of carriers, aircraft, and fuel supplies. Another critical function was traffic analysis, managed by Lieutenant Commanders Thomas Huckins and John Williams. Rather than decrypting content, they examined communication patterns, which stations were contacting each other, message frequency, priority flags, and shifts in call signs. Such analysis often offered early warning of enemy operations, sometimes days or weeks before cryptanalysts could fully decode messages. For instance, increased communication between carrier groups and supply units might signal an imminent operation, while sudden radio silence could indicate that a fleet had deployed. Station Hypo's small team worked under intense pressure in a cramped, windowless basement with limited resources and an overwhelming flow of intercepted communications. Each Japanese naval transmission arrived as a series of 5-digit groups recorded by radio operators stationed across the Pacific, including Hawaii and Australia. Messages were sent to Hypo for processing, where cryptanalysts first had to remove additive encryption, a process in which a 5-digit number was mathematically combined with the original code group through non-carrying addition. For example, if the message code was 12,345 and the additive sequence was 67,890, each digit was added individually without carrying, producing a complex encrypted string such as 79,135. This painstaking work, demanding both mathematical precision and cultural insight, would ultimately position Station Hypo to provide the intelligence crucial to one of the most decisive engagements in naval history. Decoding Japanese naval messages required first determining which additive table had been applied to each intercepted communication. Analysts then had to reverse the addition process to recover the original code groups. This step alone could consume hours for a single intercepted dispatch. Cryptographers maintained extensive archives of recovered additive sequences, meticulously organized by date and radio channel, in order to detect patterns in Japanese encryption practices. Once the raw code groups were restored, the task of interpretation began. Analysts relied on massive card catalogs representing years of accumulated knowledge about the potential meanings of 5-digit numbers. Through careful comparison across multiple messages, they made informed conjectures. Patterns of repetition provided critical clues. A code group recurring frequently in messages between operational units often corresponded to aircraft, aviation fuel, or flight missions, whereas groups appearing in logistical communications were likely associated with supplies, ammunition, or fuel. IBM punch card machines greatly accelerated the process of sorting and searching thousands of messages to identify recurring groupings and usage patterns. Despite this technological assistance, the core analytical work depended entirely on human skill. Only trained cryptographers could recognize meaningful associations, interpret context, and make the leaps of intuition necessary to convert fragmented data into actionable intelligence. The effort resembled high-level investigative work, combining mathematical exactness, linguistic insight, cultural knowledge, and creativity. By March 1942, Station Hypo had made enough headway against the Japanese JN-25 code to produce intelligence of operational value. Their progress was not the result of a single discovery, but the culmination of months of painstaking, incremental work. Each decoded group made subsequent intercepts slightly easier to interpret, and every identified additive accelerated decryption. Gradually, the previously impenetrable Japanese communications began to yield information. This intelligence proved critical during the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, enabling the USS Navy to locate Japanese carrier forces and force a tactical stalemate that stopped Japan's advance toward Australia. Coral Sea was historically significant in several ways. It marked the first naval engagement in which opposing fleets never sighted each other directly, with all attacks conducted by carrier-based aircraft. The battle confirmed that American naval aviators could effectively challenge the veteran Japanese carrier forces, and it temporarily neutralized 2 Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, removing them from subsequent operations. Despite these advances, decryption remained incomplete and frustratingly slow. At best, analysts could interpret only 30 to 40% of any single message. Japanese operational security was adaptive. Frequent changes to codebooks and additives required constant adjustments. Every message had the potential to contain intelligence that could prevent loss of life or disaster, and every hour spent on an indecipherable dispatch was a lost opportunity. Cryptographers worked under the pressure of knowing that their effectiveness had a direct impact on American casualties. By mid-May, the volume of Japanese transmissions rose sharply. Communications flowed between the combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, submarine units, battleship groups, and invasion task forces, signaling preparations for a major operation scheduled for early June. Each partially decrypted message contributed another fragment to the puzzle. The target, designated AF in Japanese code, was believed by Station Hypo to be Midway Island, a small atoll located approximately 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, containing a modest but strategically vital American airfield. Midway's limited size, just over 2 miles across, belied its importance. Controlling it would allow Japan to threaten Hawaii and disrupt American communications across the Central Pacific. More critically, a Japanese strike against Midway could draw the remaining U.S. carriers into a decisive engagement. Admiral Yamamoto's strategy depended on eliminating the carriers before America's industrial capacity could produce replacements. Japan needed a rapid, decisive victory in 1942 while it still held numerical and operational superiority. In contrast, the Navy's primary cryptanalysis center in Washington, OP-20G, disagreed with Hypo's assessment. Despite having greater resources, personnel, and technological advantages, OP-20G lacked Hypo's specialized focus on Pacific operations and cumulative experience with Japanese naval communications. Analysts in Washington speculated that AF might refer to the Aleutian Islands, a renewed operation in the South Pacific toward Port Moresby, Fiji, or Samoa, or even a direct attack on Hawaii or the continental U.S. Takuate. The absence of certainty hindered Admiral Nimitz from deploying forces effectively. Concentrating near Midway could leave other targets undefended. Tensions between Hypo and OP-20G were exacerbated by personnel changes in Washington. Commander John Redmond, a communications officer with limited cryptanalytic expertise, had replaced Lawrence Safford, a highly respected Navy cryptologist. Redmond emphasized procedural correctness and hierarchical reporting over analytical insight, which contrasted sharply with Hypo's rapid, intelligence-driven workflow. Hypo's team, led by Joseph Rochefort, reported directly to Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, a longtime associate. This direct line allowed intelligence to reach the fleet immediately, bypassing the layers of review in Washington, a method that maximized operational impact but provoked bureaucratic frustration. From Rochefort's perspective, wartime exigencies demanded speed and accuracy, not adherence to protocol. The combination of meticulous decryption, intuitive analysis, and direct communication ultimately allowed U.S. forces to anticipate Japanese movements and prepare for the decisive engagement that would follow at Midway. Admiral Ernest King, who held the dual roles of Chief of Naval Operations and Commander of the entire United States Navy, placed more trust in his staff in Washington than in the informal intelligence network operating out of Hawaii. King was renowned for his exceptional strategic mind, but also for a notoriously sharp and uncompromising personality, demanding strict adherence to protocol. He had a pronounced dislike for Lieutenant Commander Joseph J. Joe Rochefort, regarding him as both insubordinate and overly self-assured. Similarly, Commander John Redmond, who directed OP-20G, the Navy's main cryptologic office in Washington, was irritated by Rochefort's autonomy and believed that all intelligence assessments should be centralized. This tension was not merely bureaucratic. The stakes were extraordinarily high. If Admiral Chester W. Nimitz positioned the U.S. carriers around Midway and the Japanese chose a different target, the U.S. could lose not only the carriers but also fail to defend the actual objective of the Japanese attack. At the time, the American Navy had only 3 carriers in the Pacific, and a single miscalculation could be catastrophic. The memory of Pearl Harbor was still fresh, and another disaster on that scale could expose Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast to invasion, leaving the Pacific Fleet critically weakened. Determining the meaning of the Japanese code designation AF was therefore a matter of life and death. The solution came from Captain Wilfred J. Jasper Holmes, a former submariner assigned to intelligence work at Station Hypo in Hawaii. Holmes combined operational practicality with sharp analytical skills. He proposed an ingenious plan. Midway should transmit a clear, unencrypted message claiming that the island's water desalination plant had malfunctioned and that the base was running low on fresh water. The logic was straightforward. If Japanese intelligence intercepted this message and subsequently reported that AF was experiencing a water shortage, Hypo would have concrete evidence that AF referred to Midway. The elegance of Holmes's approach lay in its simplicity. The Japanese were actively monitoring U.S. communications, just as U.S. cryptologists were intercepting Japanese messages. A plain language emergency about a water shortage at a tropical base would appear perfectly plausible, as equipment failures were common in such environments. There would be no reason for the Japanese to suspect deception. Rochefort immediately recognized the brilliance of Holmes's concept and presented it to Edwin Layton, who in turn brought it to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz was a commander who trusted his intelligence officers and understood the value of calculated risk. He approved the ruse without hesitation. Using a secure submarine cable that could not be intercepted by Japanese forces, Midway's garrison commander was instructed to send the emergency water request over open radio channels. Between May 19 and May 21, 1942, the message was transmitted. Within 48 hours, Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report indicating that AF was indeed facing water shortages. The confirmation was decisive, was Midway. While the Japanese were evidently preparing to strike, analysts in Washington remained doubtful. OP-20G predicted an assault in mid-June, whereas Hypo's calculations suggested late May or early June. The difference hinged on the analysis of date-time groups embedded in Japanese messages, which were encrypted using a secondary complex system layered atop the main JN-25 code. Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, working under Chief Dyer at Hypo, made a breakthrough by deciphering the Japanese method for encoding date-time indicators. This enabled Hypo to pinpoint not only the target but also the timing of the impending attack. On May 26, they successfully decrypted orders directing 2 destroyer groups to escort invasion transports, revealing that the assault would take place on either June 4 or June 5, 1942. This precision was unparalleled in wartime intelligence, giving Admiral Nimitz the extraordinary advantage of knowing both where and when the Japanese would strike. Despite the compelling evidence, some in Washington worried that Rochefort's conclusions were overly assertive. They feared he was reading certainty into fragmented data and allowing his confidence to overrule analytical caution. Admiral King remained skeptical, aware that a misstep could end Rochefort's career and cost American lives. Rochefort, however, had unwavering confidence in the team's analysis. For weeks, his unit had worked around the clock under grueling conditions, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and occasional sandwiches, meticulously decrypting message traffic, tracking units, monitoring logistics, and cross-referencing multiple indicators. All paths pointed to the same conclusion. Midway was the objective, early June was the time frame, and the Japanese would deploy 4 carriers. By May 27, Hypo had decrypted enough material to reconstruct nearly the entire Japanese order of battle. They confirmed that the assault force included the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by 2 battleships, including the enormous Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. The force was further reinforced by 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers carrying roughly 250 carrier-based aircraft flown by highly experienced pilots. This intelligence provided Nimitz with an unprecedented level of operational clarity, allowing him to position his limited forces strategically against Japan's formidable fleet. In early June 1942 US, naval intelligence had acquired an extraordinary level of insight into Japanese plans. The Americans were aware that a force of approximately 5,000 Japanese troops was slated to land on Midway on June 7th. The intelligence was so precise that Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and his staff could forecast not only the route the Japanese fleet would take, but also the timing of their initial air assaults and the makeup of their attack groups. On May 27, during a Pacific Fleet staff conference, intelligence officers Joseph Rochefort and Edwin Layton presented their findings to Nimitz. The room was filled with officers, many of whom were skeptical that the intelligence could be this detailed. Rochefort, still wearing his bathrobe, methodically explained the reasoning behind each conclusion. He displayed partially decrypted Japanese communications and outlined the analytic methods that had allowed them to infer the enemy's intentions so accurately. Never before in naval history had any fleet possessed such a comprehensive understanding of an adversary's operational plans before engagement. This achievement represented a level of cryptanalysis that would remain unmatched in scale. The breakthrough came through a combination of Rochefort's team's work on the JN-25 code, the sheer volume of Japanese communications, and Tokyo's confidence in the security of its ciphers. The result was a rare intelligence window Nimitz had knowledge that even some of Admiral Yamamoto's own officers did not possess. He understood the Japanese commander's strategy better than many of Yamamoto's subordinates, yet intelligence alone could not secure victory. Nimitz faced a grave operational challenge. The Pacific Fleet had 3 aircraft carriers available: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Enterprise and Hornet were in good operational condition, but Yorktown had suffered heavy damage during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Initial damage assessments had predicted that Yorktown would require 3 months of repairs at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. The ship had sustained structural damage to the flight deck, critical harm to the fuel system, and fires that had claimed dozens of crew members. In practical terms, she should have been unavailable for combat until late summer. In an audacious move, Nimitz ordered the Pearl Harbor repair teams to restore Yorktown to a functional state in just 3 days, enough to launch and recover aircraft, though far from a full repair. The naval crews initially considered this an impossible task. What followed was an extraordinary feat of engineering and labor. At 11 a.m. on May 28, Yorktown entered Dry Dock No. 1. Over 1,400 workers began a round-the-clock effort to repair the flight deck, restore electrical and mechanical systems, and patch structural damage. Many of the fixes were temporary measures, intended to hold only for the upcoming battle. Yet, in less than 3 days of continuous work, Yorktown was made ready to sail and rejoin Enterprise and Hornet, demonstrating an unparalleled industrial achievement. Facing the experienced Japanese naval aviators, Nimitz's pilots were comparatively green. Japan's carrier airmen had been at war since 1937, accumulating hundreds of combat hours in China and across the Pacific. They had trained extensively as cohesive strike teams and operated their carriers in coordinated groups since the war's outset. American carrier doctrine, by contrast, was still developing. Many USS pilots had little or no combat experience and minimal exposure to carrier operations. The imbalance in skill and experience was stark. However, Nimitz possessed an invaluable advantage: intelligence of unprecedented precision. Nimitz deployed his carriers to a location later designated Point Luck, roughly 350 miles northeast of Midway. From this position, they could lie in wait and strike the Japanese carriers after the first assault on Midway's airfields. The Japanese, confident in their operational security, expected to encounter minimal resistance. They planned to attack the island, rearm and refuel their aircraft, and then seek out American carriers that they assumed were still far from the battle zone. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese strike force, believed he had hours to operate freely before encountering opposition. He expected to coerce Midway into submission in the morning and then hunt for U.S. carriers in the afternoon, if any were present. The idea that 3 American carriers were already lying in ambush northeast of the island never entered his calculations. Japanese intelligence had informed him that Yorktown had been destroyed at Coral Sea, that Enterprise and Hornet were thousands of miles away, and that no American carrier could possibly be within striking distance. Nimitz's gamble was extraordinarily high risk. If the intelligence regarding Japanese fleet position, timing, or composition was incorrect, the Pacific Fleet could have been annihilated, leaving Hawaii defenseless. If the analysis was accurate but the Japanese struck a different location, both the carriers and the true target would be lost. Even if the intelligence and location were correct, a poorly executed battle could still eliminate America's last 3 carriers and potentially doom the Pacific theater. The entire plan depended on the interpretation of intercepted Japanese communications, the identification of code groups, and the careful synthesis of fragmented intelligence into a coherent operational picture. Thanks to Rochefort and his team, Nimitz had the clearest picture of the Japanese strike force ever achieved. Execution, however, still depended entirely on the American sailors and aviators. On June 3, 1942, patrol aircraft confirmed the approach of the Japanese fleet from the northwest exactly as predicted. PBY Catalina flying boats, operating at the limits of their endurance, first spotted the transport ships and then the carriers. Each sighting validated the intelligence analysis. Location, timing, and fleet composition were all correct. The groundwork for the Battle of Midway, one of the most decisive naval confrontations in history, was now firmly established. Admiral Nimitz's risky strategic decision had proven accurate. The stage was set for a confrontation at Midway. Just before sunrise on June 4, 1942, a force of 108 Japanese aircraft took off from 4 aircraft carriers, heading toward the island. The striking force consisted of 36 ID-3A dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers outfitted with high-explosive bombs for attacks on land installations, and 36 Mitsubishi A6M00 fighters. At 5:45 a.m., Midway's radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation at a distance of 93 miles. Every available American aircraft was dispatched to intercept the attackers. The initial strike by the Japanese inflicted severe damage on Midway's infrastructure, destroying fuel storage tanks, hangars, and the central command facility. American fighter aircraft attempted to engage the Japanese, but the superior maneuverability of the Zeros overwhelmed them. Marine Corps pilots flying outdated F-2A Buffalo fighters suffered heavy losses. Ground-based anti-aircraft fire caused some damage, but the majority of the Japanese objectives were achieved. After assessing the situation, the Japanese formation commander signaled that a follow-up attack would be necessary to neutralize the base entirely. Although the runways had sustained damage, they remained functional, and a portion of Midway's defensive aircraft survived the initial strike. The real turning point began when American aircraft launched from Midway counterattacked the Japanese carriers. Marine Corps dive bombers, Army Air Force B-17 bombers, and Navy torpedo bombers conducted coordinated assaults on the enemy fleet but failed to score hits, suffering significant casualties. Nonetheless, these attacks forced the Japanese to keep their defensive fighters engaged, disrupted their operations, and demonstrated that U.S. forces were far more resilient and capable than Japanese intelligence had anticipated. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo confronted a critical operational dilemma. Aircraft returning from the first strike were low on fuel and needed to land. After reviewing the initial results, Nagumo followed doctrine and prepared a second strike on Midway to ensure complete suppression of the base. His reserve aircraft were ordered to be rearmed with bombs suitable for land targets, necessitating the removal of armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes from aircraft on the hangar decks. At 7:28 a.m., a late-launched Japanese scout plane reported spotting 10 American surface vessels to the northeast. The initial report did not identify the ship types, but their presence was unexpected, faced with the possibility of USS carriers nearby. Despite prior intelligence suggesting otherwise, Nagumo immediately halted the rearming for a land strike and directed his crews to reinstall anti-ship weapons, including torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The Japanese carriers' flight decks and hangars quickly descended into a state of organized chaos. Aircraft were fueled and armed, while bombs and torpedoes were being moved and attached in rapid succession. Loose munitions littered the decks, creating an extremely hazardous environment with high concentrations of aviation fuel fumes in the air. By 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers appeared over the Japanese fleet. 3 squadrons of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, separated from their fighter escorts and torpedo squadrons during their approach, had located the enemy at the ideal moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey of the Enterprise Air Group had extended his search path, risking fuel reserves to locate the Japanese carriers. His decision proved decisive when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer moving to rejoin its carrier group. At this moment, the Japanese carriers were preparing to launch their second strike, with fully armed and fueled aircraft on deck. Their combat air patrol fighters were engaged at low altitude, having just completed attacks on American torpedo bombers, the previous U.S. torpedo bomber assault, though largely unsuccessful in hitting targets, had drawn Japanese fighters downward and disrupted their defensive coordination. The dauntless dive bombers, diving from altitudes around 14,000 feet at speeds approaching 250 knots, executed a flawlessly timed assault over roughly 6 minutes. The coordinated attack resulted in the destruction of 3 Japanese carriers. To observers aboard the Japanese ships, the assault appeared as a single overwhelming strike. The Akagi was hit on its flight deck by bombs that detonated among armed and fueled aircraft in the hangar bay, triggering catastrophic secondary explosions and rapidly spreading fires. Admiral Nimitz and his staff were forced to abandon the flagship as fires and explosions consumed the vessel. Similarly, Kaga suffered multiple bomb hits. The captain ordered evacuation but remained aboard, ultimately going down with his ship. Fires, explosions, and structural damage left the carriers incapacitated in mere minutes. This sequence of events marked a decisive turning point in the Battle of Midway, demonstrating how precise timing, tactical adaptation, and the courage of U.S. aircrews could overcome the numerical and technological advantages of the Japanese fleet. The Japanese aircraft carrier Soryu sustained 3 consecutive direct hits in rapid succession, each strike inflicting catastrophic damage. Explosions tore through the flight deck, and the hangar rapidly became engulfed in flames. Despite the crew's desperate efforts to contain the inferno, the ship's condition quickly became irreparable. After approximately 20 minutes of intense firefighting, the captain gave the order for the crew to abandon ship, choosing to remain aboard himself. 7 hours later, the vessel sank, taking 711 of its crew to the depths. Within the same critical minutes of the battle, all 3 of the other Japanese carriers present suffered similar fates. Uncontrollable fires forced their crews to evacuate, leaving the ships to burn. Japanese naval doctrine prioritized fire suppression over flooding control, but this approach proved insufficient against the scale of damage and the raging fuel-fed fires. One carrier, Hiryu, had earlier become detached from the main force and initially avoided the devastating attacks. She managed to launch counterstrikes, significantly damaging the American carrier Yorktown with bombs and torpedoes that temporarily immobilized it. Nevertheless, U.S. dive bombers later located Hiryu, and by late afternoon she too was left ablaze, mirroring the destruction of her sister ships. By the evening of June 4, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had either been abandoned or were sinking. Japan suffered a loss of 3,587 personnel, including many of its most skilled pilots and maintenance specialists. Among the casualties were elite aviators who had played key roles in the attack on Pearl Harbor, the conquest of the Philippines, and the destruction of the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse. Their expertise and experience, amassed over months of early wartime dominance in the Pacific, could not be replaced. The United States lost the Yorktown 2 days later while she was being towed after being struck by torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-168 on June 6. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier, and a third sank the accompanying destroyer Hammond. Yorktown eventually capsized and sank on June 7. Overall American losses were 362 personnel. In roughly 6 minutes of meticulously executed dive bombing, the balance of naval power in the Pacific shifted irreversibly. Japan, which had entered the conflict with overwhelming carrier strength, found itself crippled. 4 of its 6 fleet carriers were destroyed at Midway, with no feasible way to replace them. Japanese shipbuilding capacity could not match the vast industrial output of the United States, which was already preparing a new generation of carriers, the Essex class, larger and more capable than those lost. From that point forward, Japan was forced into a defensive posture, with each engagement aimed at holding territory rather than expanding it. The sheer industrial weight of the United States would steadily erode Japan's position in the Pacific. The success at Midway owed much to the precise timing of the dive bomber attack, which struck the carriers at their most vulnerable moments while aircraft were being rearmed. This achievement was only possible due to the breakthrough in breaking the Japanese naval code JN-25 and the exhaustive analytical work by Commander Joseph Rochefort's team at Station Hypo in Hawaii. By deciphering Japanese operational patterns, they were able to predict the enemy's actions with remarkable accuracy. Despite the critical role of this intelligence, recognition for the achievement was contentious. Bureaucratic rivalry between Station Hypo in Hawaii and OP-20G in Washington intensified after Midway, with both claiming credit. Commander John Redman, leading OP-20G, resented Rochefort's independent operations and direct access to Admiral Nimitz, while his brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, supported centralizing control of codebreaking in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, also favored centralization and distrusted Rochefort's unconventional methods. Only 4 months after Midway, in October 1942, Rochefort was removed from command at Station Hypo and reassigned to oversee a floating dry dock in San Francisco. While the official explanation cited the need for sea duty to advance his career, it was widely understood as punishment for defying the chain of command. Nimitz reportedly protested the decision but lacked authority over King, who controlled the Navy at large. Nimitz did, however, recommend Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal, highlighting his exceptional analytical work and its decisive impact on the victory at Midway. In short, the Battle of Midway represented a turning point in the Pacific War. A combination of courage, precision bombing, and groundbreaking intelligence work eliminated Japan's offensive carrier capability and set the stage for a long-term strategic advantage for the United States. The award Rochefort had sought was denied by the King's office, a decision that effectively ended any further involvement he might have had in cryptanalysis. He never returned to code-breaking work. Instead, he was assigned to command a floating dry dock, a peripheral role far beneath the level of responsibility suitable for an officer of his skill. Subsequently, he was transferred to administrative positions at Pacific Fleet Headquarters. The coveted sea command he had hoped for never materialized, and his career plateaued at the rank of captain. When he retired in 1953, the recognition he arguably deserved for his role at Midway had not been granted. The denial of acknowledgement represented a serious injustice, one that would take decades to address. Nonetheless, the critical intelligence work continued through late 1942 and into 1943. At Station Hypo, the team continued intercepting and deciphering Japanese naval messages. Though leadership had changed, the intelligence produced remained vital. It played a key role in the Guadalcanal campaign, a grueling 6-month struggle for a strategically important island. The decrypted communications allowed American forces to anticipate Japanese movements, deploy ships advantageously in naval battles, identify reinforcement convoys, and understand enemy intentions. This information directly supported the broader island-hopping strategy across the Central Pacific, enabling American forces to bypass heavily defended Japanese strongholds, capture less fortified islands, and sever supply lines while steadily advancing toward Japan. Every operation benefited from signals intelligence that revealed enemy positions, highlighted vulnerabilities, and warned of impending counterattacks. The work of Station Hypo ultimately contributed to one of the most significant missions of the war, Operation Vengeance in April 1943. Based on intercepted Japanese messages, American pilots were able to locate and shoot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor and Japan's foremost naval strategist. Yamamoto had been traveling from Rabaul to Bougainville to inspect frontline units. Through careful decryption, Station Hypo obtained his full flight schedule, including departure, route, and arrival times. This intelligence reached President Roosevelt, who approved the operation. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Guadalcanal, intercepted Yamamoto's plane precisely according to schedule, and successfully executed the mission. His death dealt a significant blow to Japanese morale and strategic command. Thomas Deere remained at Station Hypo for the duration of the war, rising to the rank of captain. His work on the Japanese Naval Code JN-25 and his leadership in achieving the breakthroughs that made the Midway victory possible earned him recognition within cryptologic circles as a pioneer of machine-assisted cryptanalysis. After the war, he became one of the foremost instructors in cryptanalysis for the Armed Forces Security Agency and, later, the National Security Agency, alongside William Friedman and Lambros Kalamajos. His methods for integrating IBM machines into code-breaking practice influenced generations of signals intelligence professionals. Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, had been an early advocate for Rashford's work and continued to champion his contributions throughout the Pacific War. Layton retired as a rear admiral and devoted decades after the conflict to securing proper recognition for Rashford. In 1985, his memoir, And I Was There, documented Rashford's achievements and the unfair treatment he had endured. Layton's persistence helped ensure that Rashford's role would not be forgotten. Joseph Finnegan, who had discovered the method to decrypt Japanese date-time groups, also continued a distinguished cryptanalytic career, becoming a leading figure in post-war signals intelligence. His breakthrough was crucial for determining the exact timing of Japanese attacks, allowing Admiral Nimitz to position forces with perfect precision. Without this insight, American carriers might have arrived too early and exhausted their fuel, or too late and missed the battle entirely. The linguists, traffic analysts, and cryptographers who had worked tirelessly in the cramped, secretive quarters of Pearl Harbor went on to varied careers after the war. Most remained silent about their wartime contributions due to long-standing classification restrictions. For decades, the public, families, and even local communities were unaware of the roles these men had played in shaping history. The full extent of American success against Japanese codes remained classified until the 1972, when the National Security Agency began declassifying historical materials related to World War II cryptanalysis. Only then could historians and the broader public appreciate the depth of American code breaking, the strategic impact of decrypted intelligence, and the essential contributions of individuals like Rashford and Deere. In 1980, efforts began in earnest to formally recognize Rashford's crucial work, a long overdue acknowledgement of his impact on the outcome of the Pacific War. Admiral Donald Max Showers, who had extensive experience in naval intelligence during World War II and later held positions at the CIA, spearheaded the initiative to formally recognize Joseph Rashford's contributions. He was supported by Navy Secretary John Lehman, whose awareness of both the historical significance of Rashford's work and the unfair treatment he had endured proved invaluable. As previously classified records were gradually declassified and made accessible to historians, the full scale of Station Hypo's accomplishments finally became widely known. On May 30, 1986, nearly 44 years after the pivotal Battle of Midway, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal to Rochefort. Rochefort had passed away on July 20, 1976, unaware that he would eventually receive the acknowledgement he had long deserved. The award was accepted on his behalf by his children during a ceremony at the White House. The official citation highlighted his consistently exceptional performance and emphasized that his intelligence work had been instrumental in securing the U.S. Navy's victory at Midway. While the wording was measured, it understated the profound importance of Rashford's achievements, which represented one of the most consequential intelligence successes in American military history. Rashford's effectiveness stemmed from a rare combination of skills. He possessed exceptional mathematical talent necessary for cryptanalysis, an in-depth understanding of Japanese language and culture acquired during 3 years of study in Tokyo from 1929 to 1932, advanced analytical capabilities, and leadership qualities that promoted collaborative problem-solving. He demonstrated moral courage by circumventing bureaucratic delays to ensure critical intelligence reached the commanders who required it. At the same time, he maintained rigorous standards of accuracy under pressure from Washington, exemplifying intellectual integrity. His leadership style encouraged junior officers to contribute fully, regardless of rank, fostering a culture of innovative teamwork. Station Hypo's success in breaking the Japanese naval code JN-25 relied on every team member operating at peak capacity, sharing insights, questioning assumptions, and assembling fragmented data into coherent intelligence. Analysts like Thomas Deere, who willingly endured long hours with pharmaceutical aid, exemplified dedication that exceeded normal expectations. The entire Station Hypo team demonstrated that seemingly insurmountable problems could be overcome through innovation, collaboration, and relentless commitment. Their work directly affected the outcome of Midway. Pilots, sailors, and commanders relied entirely on the intelligence produced by these analysts. Technically, the task was staggering. JN-25 encompassed tens of thousands of code groups, and each intercepted message presented millions of possible interpretations. Successful decryption required a combination of accumulated expertise, sharp intuition, pattern recognition, and creative problem-solving. Although IBM punch card machines assisted with sorting and organizing data, the decisive breakthroughs arose from human ingenuity and analytical skill. There were no modern computers, automated analysis tools, or machine learning algorithms, only pencils, paper, punch cards, and minds operating at their utmost limits. Analysts understood that time was critical. Each new message could contain intelligence capable of saving thousands of lives. Rochefort's work demonstrated that signals intelligence could decisively shape the outcomes of modern warfare. His achievements illustrated that investing in cryptanalysis, even under seemingly insurmountable challenges, could generate results that altered history. Military leaders learned that trusting intelligence assessments, even when they contradicted conventional assumptions, could enable victories that would otherwise be impossible. The strategic consequences of the Midway intelligence breakthrough were far-reaching. Japan's defeat led to U.S. occupation and the country's transformation into a democratic ally, while the Pacific Islands, secured by the USX, became pivotal positions during the Cold War. Naval tactics, particularly carrier-based aviation developed during the Pacific campaigns, influenced naval strategy for decades. Moreover, the cryptanalysis methods pioneered at Station Hypo evolved into the sophisticated signals intelligence systems of the National Security Agency. Ultimately, the story of Joseph Rochefort and Station Hypo underscores enduring truths about intelligence work. Success requires not only technical brilliance and analytical skill, but also creativity, ethical courage, and leadership that empowers collaboration. One individual's expertise, when combined with a dedicated team and a clear sense of purpose, proved capable of altering the course of a global conflict and shaping the post-war world. The experience gained from deciphering the Japanese naval code JN-25 had a profound and lasting impact on U.S. signals intelligence, influencing methods throughout the Cold War and continuing into the modern era. The lessons emphasized that code breaking was not merely a technical endeavor. It required the combination of cryptanalysis, meticulous traffic examination, and operational insight. The adoption of IBM tabulating machines, followed by digital computers, fundamentally transformed the speed and scope of intelligence work. Equally important was the realization that understanding an adversary demanded not only mathematical or linguistic skill, but also cultural awareness and operational experience, factors that reshaped recruitment and training in intelligence agencies for decades. In 1985, surviving members of Station Hypo, along with other cryptanalysts who had worked across the Pacific Theater, gathered for a reunion. Men in their 60s and 70s reflected on years spent in a cramped basement under extreme pressure, racing to provide timely information that could alter the course of battles. They recounted the devastating dive bomber raids that sank multiple carriers in minutes, the deceptive maneuvers that confirmed Midway as the target, and the long caffeine and stimulant-fueled shifts that became routine. Some shared anecdotes about colleagues like Rochefort, who endured the stifling heat in his bathrobe rather than compromise performance by wearing a uniform. Many attendees were moved by the memories of those who did not survive the war. Others expressed awe at what they had accomplished with rudimentary tools and limited technology. They collectively recognized that their work had not been merely a series of tasks, but a contribution of historical significance. For numerous participants, the reunion was the first chance to discuss their wartime experiences openly after decades of strict classification. Edwin Layton, then in his 80s, reflected on the extraordinary achievements of the team, highlighting Rochefort's unwavering confidence when presenting critical intelligence to Admiral Nimitz on May 27, 1942. He recalled the courage required to assert a position in the face of skepticism from Washington, and the moral strength necessary to insist on precise answers under immense pressure. Layton recounted how, on that pivotal day, Rochefort provided the Pacific Fleet with exact coordinates and timing of the Japanese attack. The precision of the intelligence allowed American carriers to be positioned optimally, creating a trap that the Japanese forces unknowingly sailed into. Such a decisive outcome was made possible only through the determination of individuals who refused to accept the task as insurmountable, who worked relentlessly despite exhaustion and who believed that rigorous analysis could directly influence the trajectory of the war. The reunion concluded with a reflection that captured the essence of Station Hypo's accomplishments. One of the surviving cryptanalysts spoke, summarizing not only personal experiences but also the broader historical significance of their work. "We entered this conflict as mathematicians, linguists, and engineers, puzzle solvers. We left as agents of change in history, not through combat but through comprehension, not through force but through intelligence. By deciphering the enemy's intentions, we saved countless lives and helped shorten a devastating war. Recognition was limited, but our contribution was undeniable." The dedication of figures such as Joseph Rochefort, who prioritized correctness over personal safety, and Thomas Deere, who endured exhausting shifts fueled by stimulants, exemplified the extraordinary commitment of the team. Each individual in that basement lab understood the stakes. Failure was not an option. The team proved that meticulous knowledge and understanding of the adversary could be as decisive as superior weaponry. The Japanese codes, composed of roughly 30,000 to 33,000 constantly shifting super-enciphered groups, appeared unbreakable, but they were systematically unraveled through intelligence, persistence, and ingenuity. The success at Midway depended on more than just pilots braving intense anti-aircraft fire, mechanics working under extreme conditions, bold decision-making by commanders, or sailors executing damage control. It relied fundamentally on intelligence. The codebreakers, who provided Admiral Nimitz with certainty about enemy plans, presented with unwavering confidence on May 27, 1942. Their work exemplified the idea that careful analysis and insight could decisively shape military outcomes. This account is dedicated to Joseph Rochefort, born May 12, 1900, who passed away on May 30, 1986, before receiving full recognition for his pivotal role in one of history's most consequential intelligence operations. To Thomas Dyer and all the cryptanalysts who devoted countless sleepless nights, risked their well-being, and sometimes even their mental stability to decipher enemy communications, this tribute is for you. To the linguists who rendered these discoveries understandable, to the analysts who detected patterns amid apparent randomness, to the radio operators who intercepted the vital transmissions, and to everyone who labored in those hidden rooms for decades without recognition, your work altered history. Your efforts saved lives. You demonstrated that intelligence, both as information and as insight, can be the most decisive weapon in warfare. The unraveling of JN-25 and the provision of the intelligence that enabled the United States to achieve victory at Midway exemplifies the pinnacle of human capability. Success in conflict does not necessarily belong to those with the strongest forces or the heaviest armaments. Rather, it favors those who can anticipate the enemy's moves with clarity exceeding that of their opponent, who persist beyond ordinary limits, and who integrate multiple disciplines, mathematics, language, cultural knowledge, intuition, and analytical reasoning into actionable strategic advantage. True victory requires leaders willing to trust analysis even when it contradicts expectations, and teams that operate collectively, subordinating ego to mission. That is exactly what occurred at Station Hypo. Through tireless work, the cryptanalysts, linguists, and mathematicians at Pearl Harbor turned what was deemed unsolvable into a systematic understanding of Japanese naval intentions. They produced actionable intelligence that allowed American forces to strike at the moment of greatest vulnerability. Consider the Battle of Midway. 5 to 6 minutes of dive bombing destroyed 3 Japanese carriers. Yet those minutes were the culmination of 6 months of intense cryptanalysis. They succeeded because Joseph Rochefort believed that Japanese codes could be deciphered. They succeeded because Thomas Dyer and others endured extended shifts under extraordinary pressure. They succeeded because a team of scholars and analysts refused to accept defeat. And they succeeded because Admiral Nimitz placed absolute trust in their intelligence, committing to a course of action that could have failed catastrophically. While the war in the Pacific was fought over 4 grueling years, June 4, 1942 marked a decisive turning point. American dive bombers struck with precision not by chance but through insight achieved in basement offices and analysis rooms. This outcome illustrates that intelligence, when cultivated patiently and rigorously, can rival the impact of the most dramatic military maneuvers. The courage of pilots and sailors executing perilous operations was matched by the dedication of those working in obscurity to provide the knowledge that made success possible. Recognition came slowly. Many cryptanalysts remained silent about their contributions for 40 years, unable to tell even their closest relatives about the work they had performed under conditions of strict secrecy. Yet when acknowledgement finally arrived, it was not just a moment of personal vindication, it was a validation of the immense, often invisible human effort required to decode the enemy's plans. The Battle of Midway was not only won on the carrier's flight decks or in the cockpits of dive bombers. It was made possible by tireless analysis in confined spaces where exhausted men turned seemingly indecipherable 5-digit codes into predictive insight. Innovation, collaboration, and relentless determination in these basement operations directly enabled the victories achieved in open combat. Joseph Rochefort passed away in 1976 in Torrance, California, before receiving full recognition for his achievements. Yet his legacy persists in the intelligence structures he helped establish, the methods he refined, and the enduring proof that understanding one's adversary is the most potent strategic weapon of all. The story of Rochefort and his team demonstrates that intellectual rigor, discipline, and persistence are as critical to victory as any fleet or ordnance. The men who cracked Jane 25 transformed the impossible into the inevitable. Their work illustrates that wars can be determined as much by mental acuity and collaborative effort as by force of arms. Complex mathematical techniques, linguistic skill, and an extraordinary commitment to their mission became more decisive than conventional weaponry. These cryptanalysts, alongside linguists, sailors, marines, and officers, enabled the United States to gain precise intelligence on Japanese movements, ultimately reshaping the course of the Pacific conflict. The enduring lesson of Midway is profound. Knowledge is power. Insight leads to success. Patient, meticulous intelligence gathering, even when it appears mundane or invisible, can shape events on a scale equivalent to major military engagements. The decisive moments on June 4, 1942 were made possible by months of unseen work, conducted by individuals who refused to concede to impossibility and who demonstrated that understanding an enemy is the essential first step in defeating them. Through relentless dedication, teamwork, and intellectual courage, a small group of people working in a basement proved that human ingenuity can rewrite history. They converted encrypted messages into actionable intelligence, ensuring that the United States could respond with precision and decisiveness. These men, mathematicians, linguists, and analysts, showed that disciplined knowledge, when properly applied, can achieve outcomes far beyond the reach of brute force. Their accomplishment stands as one of the greatest feats of intelligence in history, demonstrating that the mind, properly focused and rigorously applied, is sometimes the most powerful weapon of all.